It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Todd Clear, who is currently the Dean of the School of Criminal Justice at Rutgers University. Since receiving his PhD in criminal justice from SUNY Albany, in fact, he was one of the first people to do so and one of the first people in the United States to get a PhD in criminal justice, Dr. Clear has held professorships and academic posts at Ball State, Rutgers, Florida State, and John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He has authored 12 books and over 150 articles and book chapters on a variety of criminal justice topics, mostly in corrections. He's given over 60 invited lectures, legislative testimonies, and keynote addresses such as this one today. For those of you interested in the topic of our convocation, you can read any of his 3 books about community justice, one called Community Justice, Imprisoning Communities, and What is Community Justice? Also, the Community Justice Ideal. So he knows a few things about the topic of our convocation today. He has held a number of prestigious positions and received numerous awards. To list them all would take up most of the morning, so I'm not going to do that, and plus he would be embarrassed. Todd has had an interesting personal faith journey. His father was a minister of the Protestant faith. I don't know exactly what church. Church of God, back in Indiana when he was growing up. He told me this morning that his father offered him a position. His father worked at Anderson College, I believe, in Indiana, and out of graduate school, his father asked him if he wanted to work at Anderson College, and being, 25 years old, he said no. I don't want to work at Anderson College. It's a religious-based institution. He was in that point where he was questioning that, I'm sure. So his father was a minister, and then later on, Dr. Clear became active in the Society of Friends, a Quaker church. In the last 10 years, he has fully and faithfully converted to Judaism. Right? So you should know, Todd, that the Jesuits here at Scranton hope that your brief visit will make you consider another conversion. We'll have you appointments with them after lunch. But speaking of religion, I must confess, as a good Catholic boy, that I've had the pleasure of knowing Todd for almost 30 years. Yeah, it's been 28 years, Todd, believe it or not. And 20 years ago, he was the chair of my dissertation committee. My dissertation was about religion in prison. And it's also an interesting story. If you want to know, I'll tell you some other time, but how that happened. And Todd was my dissertation chair. He's been a superb mentor, but even a better friend. And I know his family, he's also a tremendous father and husband. So, Dr. Clear, we welcome you to the National Convocation of Jail and Prison Ministry.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. Let me say I've known Harry for, as you now know, for 28 years, and I don't think I've usually been smart enough to never allow you to introduce me. So, yeah, slipping one. So in the spirit that Harry did part of the introduction, let me talk a little bit about orientation toward spirituality and religion, and then I'll get into community justice. I think my interest in community justice is very much tied to my interest in spiritual growth. I'm a spiritual work in progress, I think, since all of my uncles, both of my brothers, my sister-in-law, and most of my cousins are ordained ministers, my story's pretty interesting. So when I told my brother that I'd converted to Judaism, he, after his jaw came up from the floor, I said, I've been on your prayer list for a long time. You just weren't specific enough. So, I'll do more religion jokes. One more religion story. So I think the most interesting research I've ever done, and I've done a lot of different kinds of studies on different topics, but the most interesting study I've ever done was, Harry was involved in part of it, was a study of religion in prisons. There's nothing to me more interesting than the idea of people who are behind bars, essentially cast out of society, the targets of our opprobrium, embracing a journey of faith with enthusiasm in circumstances that I certainly couldn't do that. And the stories are just interesting. Those of you who spend time behind walls know what I'm talking about, but for most people, it's a pretty surprising idea. I spend time thinking about religion in confinement contexts as a hobby. It's not a central research topic for me, but it's one of those things that whenever I get exposed to it, and this is an example, I'm reminded about how much challenging reality there is in this topic, and how much personal growth can come from exposing yourself to people who are struggling with incarceration and moral assignment in life and the physical issues that go with being blamed for serious crimes all at the same time. A burden I know I couldn't carry if I were in their place. So I'm going to talk about community justice. Let me give you a verbal outline of the talk. I'm going to define community justice as an idea. As Harry said, I've been thinking about community justice for a while. I'm going to give 3 reasons why I think community justice is an idea that is popular today, important today. Those 3 reasons are the history that brings us to this particular moment in time, a long and distinguished research literature on incarceration and society, and then ethics and morals. I'll conclude with a little bit of a conversation about what is needed now. And then we'll open it up for questions or comments. Usually I say something that outrages at least one person. If I don't bother somebody here, then I haven't really done my job. You know, college professors get to say things that other people find difficult to say. Too few college professors use that opportunity to do it. But I am a tenured full professor at Rutgers University, and I will say what is on my mind. So I'm going to first compare criminal justice with community justice, and compare them in terms of some of the dimensions that are important. So traditional community justice defines justice, the word justice, pretty specifically and fairly narrowly. It says justice is done when people who have committed crime, have broken the law, are rightfully apprehended, rightfully accused, rightfully processed, and appropriately punished. And when that process is over, from a criminal justice standpoint, we say justice has been done. If you find the wrong person, we say justice has not been done. If the penalty seems to be too lenient or too severe, we say justice has not been done. If the process falls down, as it often does, breaks down as it often does, we say justice has not been done. But it'll be interesting in my summary of that, and it should ring true, right? This is what we mean when we say criminal justice. That's what we mean by justice. That victims and the word victim and the word community never entered the conversation. It is essentially, the idea of traditional criminal justice is essentially about the state representing us, carrying out state functions with regard to individuals who are among us. The strategy is punitive and corrective. Justice is done if the punishment is appropriate to the offense that has been proven appropriately, and justice has been done if there is some corrective aspect to that punishment. Some people would like to see punishment just be punishment, but for the most part, people who believe in traditional criminal justice want the sanctions we impose to have some corrective capacity. I'll talk about that more a little bit later. Traditional criminal justice is very much dependent on law. It is very much dependent on individual cases within that law, and it is very much dependent upon precedent. So if a person historically has been punished for a crime getting between 2 and 3 years, we will then argue that the next person coming along who is convicted of that crime should get somewhere between 2 and 3 years. That's what precedent means. Not just the Supreme Court idea of precedent, meaning Supreme Court rules have power because they are the precedent, but also, history's precedent. And finally, finally, traditional criminal justice has a social message. It says that people who disobey society's rules will be and should be sanctioned by that society. Does that sound like a fair summary of the traditional model? I'm trying not to put it down. I'm obviously, I spent a career studying it. I have a PhD in the term criminal justice, so I'm trying to do the phrase criminal justice justice. But I'm not a big fan of criminal justice, and I'll tell you why. So community justice is a different model. It's not an opposite model. It's not an opposed model. It's just a different idea. So whereas criminal justice says justice occurs when individuals who committed bad acts are appropriately apprehended, appropriately processed, and appropriately sanctioned, community justice says justice occurs when, after the process is over, the world is a better place. So it's not opposite. It's different. So criminal justice actually could produce community justice. It's just a different question, right? And you can actually have the criminal justice process within a community justice framework. But the question for community justice is the world a better place? As a result, the community justice ideal doesn't have pure punitive and corrective ideas, as criminal justice does. It has restorative and reparative ideas. It attempts to say something broken has happened, right? Some breaking has occurred. A crime has occurred, the law has been broken. A victim has been produced. A person's life has been broken. A community has been put at risk. Community ties and community capacity has been broken. We must repair them. We must restore to a previous state where things were better. A lot of debate about that, by the way. And whereas the traditional criminal justice idea is about laws and cases and precedents, community justice is about interests and groups, right? So you no longer say, I'm going to look to the law for my constraints. You instead say, I'm going to look to the way groups exist for my ideas. You no longer ask, I'm going to focus on ideas about individual cases, but you instead say, I'm going to try to think about interests that people bring to this problem. What is the interest of the community? What's the interest of the victim? And I'll talk more about that in a minute. And finally, you're not guided by precedent, you're guided by creativity. You're asked in the community justice ideal to think outside the box, to not be limited by, get it, laws, precedents, or tradition. So in that sense, it's not opposed to criminal justice, it's just entirely different. And it is so different that, in fact, once you find yourself in the community justice framework, you find criminal justice to be somehow odd as an idea. You know, it's like, I don't understand why punishment is so appealing to people when you could instead fix problems, right? Finally, while the message of criminal justice is a social message about how society works, and by the way, it's one of the oldest philosophical ideas in the world, right? If you imagine two societies, one in which people who break the laws are punished appropriately and one in which they aren't, which would be the more just society, right? It's an old philosophical idea. The aim of community justice is not a social message, it is a social outcome. It is communities being better places for people to live, work, and raise their children. And again, those aren't opposed. You can imagine that a community in which all people who break laws are appropriately punished can be good places for those things to occur. So they're not in opposition, it's just different. It's a different guiding set of ideas. So holding these two contrasting worlds in our mind, let me talk about three reasons why I think today community justice is a popular idea. And again, they are history, research, and ethics. First, history. By the way, history is the reason I got interested in community justice in the first place. Many of you know this. I'm going to cite some historical data I apologize to the people who know this. But for all of us, it's good to be reminded. America is an outlier in the punishment realm. We don't look like any other country except totalitarian dictatorships of small countries where people are oppressed and live in poverty on the punishment index. The nations that have incarceration rates that match ours are the Soviet Union and former Soviet bloc countries where the people who are in power stay in power by locking up folks for dissent. They look like us. No one else does. But this was not always true. In the United States, from the 1920s, the earliest we can do these measures, the turn of the century in the 1900s to the 1970s, the incarceration rate in the United States, the number of people locked up per 100,000 citizens, was roughly stable, fluctuating between 90 per 100,000 and 120 per 100,000 for that entire period. It would go down in times of war. Why? Because we needed young men to go fight our wars. It would go up in times of economic despair. Why? Because this was a good thing to do with young men who couldn't get jobs. But it was roughly stable for nearly a century. It was so stable that an eminent criminologist, Al Bloomstein, wrote an article that appeared in 1975 entitled The Homeostatic Theory of Punishment. And he said that societies need a sort of a stable amount of punishment in order to be able to exist as societies. And it doesn't matter what's happening, they will roughly incarcerate the same number to try to make a point. A very Durkheimian argument about social messages. Very consistent with the criminal justice model that I just described to you. What happened? Well, in 1972, the incarceration rate rose about 2%, and it rose again every year after that until 2 years ago, almost 40 years. It rose during times of war. It rose during times of peace. It rose in good economic times and in bad economic times. As the baby boomer generation came in, I'm one of them. All the children of the people coming home from World War II, as that baby bubble grew, the prison population rose, and as that bubble passed through the incarceration age group, and that size of young men started to decline, it continued to go up. It went up no matter what was happening in society. Good times, bad times, Republicans, Democrats. Nowhere in history, in this universe, has there been that kind of pattern of the use of incarceration, except in the United States, in our generation. This is not the right group to ask this question because we have people of my age group in the, that's the, I want to say fondly, the right age group in the audience. But I'm often, when I give this talk, I often ask, who was born since 1972? Raise your hand. And then people put their hands up, and then I say, you've never lived in America in a year when the prison population didn't grow. For you, it's entirely normal to be growing the prison population, no matter what else is going on. We're in Pennsylvania, by the way. You guys are like national leaders on this, right? And yet, for the whole rest of the world, for the whole rest of human history, this has never else been true. So what we think of as normal is extraordinarily abnormal. It is not normal to spend an entire generation growing the prison population. In fact, there's only one parallel time period which was like this, and that was in the South, post-Civil War. When you had a lot of free male slaves, you didn't know what to do with them, you grew the prison population for about 20 years in the South in order to find ways to sort of control that group. That history ought to trouble us. And in fact, I think something's happened in the United States. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And it's beginning to trouble us. And I'm glad to see that. It should have troubled us 20 years ago, but, you know, I'll take it. How do you get a prison population like this? How do you get a big increase in the number of prisoners like this? Well, there's recently Jim Austin and I wrote an article in which we made an argument for what I call the iron law of prison populations. Because there's a lot of debate. You know, crime goes up, Republicans are in office, the economy's bad, Let me make it very simple. The way you grow a prison population is either by the number, the prison population is entirely produced by the number of people who go there and how long they stay. Nothing else matters. I mean, a lot of other things produce those numbers, but those are the two numbers. It's like a hotel. You want to fill a hotel, you can have a lot of people stay one night, or you can have a much smaller number of people stay a week, right? In the United States, we've grown the prison population by both those mechanisms. If you divide the growth period into three rough decades, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, in the first decade, the 70s to the early part of the 80s, the prison population grew mostly as a result of growing crime rates. The proportion of people arrested per crime stayed about the same. The proportion of people going to prison given an arrest stayed about the same. The proportion and the length of stay in prison given a prison sentence stayed about the same. So it was not entirely produced by more crime. The second decade, the prison crime rates fluctuated a bit in that decade, in the 80s to the early 90s. They went up, they went down, they went up again, and they started coming down again. But the prison growth was due to changes in the proportion of people going in given a conviction for a felony. And in the third decade, when we've had essentially dropping crime rates nationally, but growing prison populations nationally, most of this was produced by increasing length of stay. So in the United States, we went from, in 1972, if you were convicted of, about 3/4 of those who were convicted of felonies ended up on probation, about 1/4 went to prison. Today, 3/4 go to prison, 1/4 go to probation. And of those 1/4 who go to probation, many of them have jail as a condition of probation, so they serve 60 or 90 days in jail before they come out onto probation. In 1972, the median lengths of stay in the United States was about 15 months. Today, it's about 32 months. So how do you get a bigger prison population? We have about the same crime rate, by the way, as we did in 72. How do you get the same, a 5 times higher incarceration rate? 5 times higher? And an increasing incarceration rate for almost a generation, for more than a generation? You systematically change the likelihood to go into prison given a, you do policy change. You change the likelihood of going to prison, and you change how long you stay if you're there. So that you reverse the likelihood of going to prison from 1/4 to 3/4, and you double the length of stay, more than double the length of stay. By the way, these numbers are affected by the fact that we don't really know length of stay because you don't know how long a person is going to stay when that person's sentenced to life in prison, right? They either get out when they're 60-some, which is some people do, or they die of old age, which many people do. And then you know how long they stayed. In 1972, we had about 180,000 prisoners. Today we have 160,000 prisoners serving life without parole. We have 1972's prison population serving life sentences. So the United States engaged in an enormous experiment focusing on the use of criminal justice in the way I have defined it as a way of dealing with crime. And by the way, for most of that time period, crime dropped. And during that time period, crime went up and down and up and down and up and down, and now it's going down. Thank God it's going down. We all benefit from crime going down. I'm not complaining about that whatsoever. But the point is, it's going down. But prison populations are not going down at the same rate. And that's because of the iron law. Prison populations are produced by how many people go there and how long they stay. The most important, effect has been how we deal with drug-related crime. We incarcerate people for possession of drugs far more than we ever used to, and for far longer. And how we deal with people convicted of crimes for the second, third, and fourth time. Recidivist statutes amplify length of stay. In the mid-'80s, I began arguing that, just on cost issues alone, this pattern was unsustainable. In 1986, I gave an address, the end of the great punishment boom. You know, you don't want me picking the World Series winner. I'm just telling you. How did we pay for this? I mean, if I told you in '72, we're going to increase prison populations for 38 years, We're going to do it whether crime goes up or crime goes down. What do you think of that? You would have said in 1972, you're nuts. We can't do that. I said, why? You said, because we can't afford it. I said, okay, fair enough. But let's say we buy it anyway. What do you think will happen? Crime will go down, you would say. Right? Society will be much safer. Well, I'm here to tell you we have paid for it. We paid for it by not investing in health care, not fixing potholes, downsizing college and public education, reducing pensions, and those are still the debates we're having today. And crime did not go down, my friends. Today, crime rates are essentially what they were in 1972. So you'd have been wrong too, just like me. So the second thing, anyway, I looked at all this and I came back from a sabbatical in 1990 in which I went away for a year and wrote the first of my community justice books, Harm in American Penology, in which I just started thinking about how attached we are to the idea of hurting people as a way of doing criminal justice. The theme of harm, just like, look, we just haven't hurt you enough yet. We just haven't hurt you the right way yet. We just haven't hurt you publicly enough yet. We just haven't hurt you in a way that sends the right message. We just, that we have this deep commitment to the benefits of hurting others, which ironically is not that different from people who hurt people and go to prison. I didn't hurt you, right? I mean, a lot of people say, what is the lesson you learn from prison? Next time I stick up a bank, I'm going to get a faster car, right? So next time I pick a victim, I'm going to pick a weaker victim. So, but that said, I was looking around for some other idea that would that I could be attracted to, and began reading about communitarians and communitarian philosophies of society, and started thinking about this idea of community justice, and wrote the first book, The Community Justice Ideal. So in that book, I thought a lot about what we know about prisons, and I'm going to say three basic sets of research findings. They're much deeper, much thicker, much more complicated. I'm going to be able to summarize them here, but I'm going to summarize them in order to make this argument about community justice. The first is that incarceration is not an equal opportunity government subsidy. It concentrates itself. It's concentrated in particular ways that are important. It's concentrated among young people. The median age at first incarceration is about 30. Over 60% of the people incarcerated are between the ages of 25 and 45. It's concentrated among men. Men are 9 times more likely to be incarcerated than women. It's concentrated among people of color. Black men are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white men. Hispanic men 3 times more likely to be incarcerated than white men. Ratios are roughly the same for women. It is so concentrated among African American males that a young black child being born today with today's incarceration rates will have a 1 chance in 3 life expectancy of going to prison sometime in his adulthood. I'm going to say that again, because it's just stunning. A black child, male child born today, if we don't change any of our policies, will have a 1 in 3 chance of, in his lifetime, ending up with a prison sentence. Now, nobody would have said in 1972, that's the world we want to produce. Can't wait to get there. But that is the world we have produced by our policies. Same crime rate, remember? By our policies. It concentrates also spatially, which I think is very important from a community justice standpoint. Some neighborhoods contribute far more of their residents to the criminal justice system than others. In almost every city in America, there is a neighborhood where 1/4 of the men will be locked up on any given day. That's not the same man all the time, right? Because 95% of the people who go in or 98% come out. So on any given day, if it's a different set of men, somebody's coming back and somebody's going in. Over time, a vast majority of the men spend time in prison. But on any given day, 1/4 are missing. 1/4 are gone. 1/4 are incarcerated. That means that of the people who are there, the men they are related to live in a prison somewhere. This has enormous impact on their lives. They spend money calling them, visiting them, money to commissary, trying to maintain relationships, trying to break relationships. The studies we have done on the concentration of incarceration and the collateral consequences of that are entirely convincing to me that this is not a policy that we would have chosen, could we have chosen it back in 1972. So for example, economically, going to prison reduces your lifetime earnings by 40%, net of everything else. Now people who go to prison aren't high earners for the most part anyway. I mean, there are some, right, white collar offenders, but for the most part, people who go to prison aren't going to earn a lot of money. But given what they were going to earn, you send them in prison, you reduce it by 40%. You have a neighborhood where 2/3 of the men have been to prison at least once. You've got a neighborhood in which the men earn 40% less as a group. The children have 40% less money to be spent on them as a group. The stores in that community have 40% fewer dollars of economic activity available to them as a group. You want to lock up a lot of people in a neighborhood, you're actually making those communities poorer by that decision. You want to know why it's so hard to recover American inner city neighborhoods that are hard hit by poverty? It's because they're hard hit by criminal justice. Families. A black man who's been to prison and is out a year is as likely to be living with a woman with children as a black man who's never been to prison at that same age. These are what demographers tell us. Bruce Western's excellent book, Punishment and Inequality in America. So a black man who's been to prison is as likely a year after prison to be living with a woman with children as a black man who never went to prison at that same age. 1/3 is likely to be married to that woman. 1/3 is likely to be married to that woman. You don't like the institution of marriage? Prison is your game. Research on census tracts finds that the biggest predictor of single-parent families at the census tract level is the proportion of people in that census tract who've been to prison. You want to break up families? Send a lot of men to prison. Just think about it, you can just understand why. You've got entire communities where the women who have children are struggling to find long-lasting relationships with the men. It changes the dynamics of intimacy in those neighborhoods. One study done in Durham, North Carolina found that sexually transmitted diseases are increased by incarceration rates in Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm sorry, I said Durham, I mean Raleigh, North Carolina. Why is that so? Because when you have 1/4 of the men missing, but it's a different set of men on any given day, you create such chaos in the intimate relationship capacities of women and men that the men actually have power in relation to the women. They can enforce different sexual relationships, enforce different kind of sexual activities, promiscuity, and so on. It's not because the men become sexually, they get sexual diseases in prison and bring them out to the community. It's because the high cycling rate through prison reinforces a kind of sexual sets of relationships in the community that promote the transmission of sexual diseases, STDs, gonorrhea, syphilis, chlamydia, and HIV. And if you want to predict teenage birth rates 15 years from now, so I want to say, what is the best predictor of high rates of teenage births at the neighborhood level? It is the number of men who've been in prison today. And if you wanted to predict crime rates, of course, teenage births would be a pretty good indicator. By concentrating incarceration among the poorest neighborhoods, we've made it harder for those neighborhoods to recover. We've made it harder for the families to be in coherent families. And we made it harder for health, harder for economies, harder for children. Having a parent go to prison increases your chances of being involved in the juvenile justice system by 25%, net of everything else. Now, you can say, look, kids who break the law should be sanctioned? Fair enough. You want to make that argument? Fair enough. But it's simply unfair to say, and the main reason they're more likely of being sanctioned is that, because they didn't have anything to do with their parents going to prison. They just got born unlucky. If you believe in justice, of the criminal justice side, then you owe those kids some dough, because by deciding to lock somebody up, you've hurt their life chances for nothing they have done. I could go on and on about collateral consequences. I have a chapter in the community justice book, the communities book, called Death by a Thousand Little Cuts, in which I summarize politics, attitudes, schools, physical health, mental health, family structure, economics, political beliefs, voting behavior, on and on and on. Concentrated incarceration in poor communities has made each of those worse. In 1972, you wouldn't have chosen that. If you'd been given a choice in 72, do you want to have that be true in 2012, 40 years from now? You'd say, no, that's a really bad set of outcomes. Let's do something different. Seems to me then you're obligated today to say, okay, let's change what we're doing. Finally, there's crime. Here are a couple of interesting facts. When you lock a person up, at least you say, boy, I can understand deterrence doesn't work because kids who grow up in neighborhoods where most of the big kids go to prison just assume they're going to go to prison. I can understand, you know, that may not be the right way you, but at least when you lock a person up, that person's not committing crimes, right? So we had 200,000 people, 180,000 people locked up in 72. We now have 2 million people locked up. We should be preventing crimes, right? Makes sense. But when you study crimes, you find that most of the kinds of crimes that people end up going to prison for are committed by young men in groups. These are loosely formed groups. They're not necessarily what we call gangs. They have different sort of floating memberships. They have floating leadership style. You know, some day somebody's the leader, this time another person's saying, let's go, and they sort of spontaneously say, hey, let's go do this. They don't plan out their crimes particularly. They happen spontaneously. These are just sort of, this is sort of the youth lifestyle of young men who live at the margins. And you lock up one of them, you don't prevent a single crime because there's a replacement. In the drug area, this is particularly true. You lock up a person for selling drugs, you create a job opening in a place where there's not very many jobs. So how can we have a 5-fold increase in the number of prisoners, same crime rate? Because most of the time, the crimes are being continue to go on, being committed by the people who are still in the community, and you just got somebody locked up. That person's not participating in now, but that person's coming out. And when that person comes out, one of the things we know is that, for the most part, criminal activity is going to occur again. So if you say, imagine two worlds, 1972 and 2012. In 72, you have 180,000 people or so locked up. 2012, you have 2 million, right? Same crime rate. This is costing you about 10 times more than this. And you can't afford to change it because you're hooked on that crime rate, on that incarceration rate, right? Because if you start letting them out more, you know that they'll engage in criminal activity at about the same rate. By the way, we have not been very good at all about changing rates of new criminality of people released from prison. Our prison system has about the same return to prison rate as European systems that are far more humane, South African systems that are far less humane, Russian systems that are actually deplorable. Going to prison, seems that no matter what you do to a person in prison, you don't change their chances of being law-abiding citizens very much by that experience. So when you think of it that way, historically and in terms of research, the problem is not that we have, we have too much crime. We have more crime than we want. The problem is not that we have poverty, we have too much poverty. The problem is that we've put policies in place that have produced this problem, and we now cannot figure out how in the hell to get out of it. We are completely committed to a losing strategy. And it is that realization that got me interested in community justice. But that's a negative argument. That's an argument on the negative. That is to say that what we're doing now is so senseless that we ought to do something different, which, by the way, is how I got interested in community justice. Now let me make the positive argument, and that is the ethical argument. So a crime occurs. One way of thinking about crime is you've broken the state's law. That's the traditional criminal justice idea. Another way of thinking about a crime is that a bad thing has happened, a harmful event has happened, with three parties to it. There is the person who's committed that act, the person who's broken the law. There's the victim of that law breaking. And there is the community in which that law breaking occurred. You can actually add a fourth level, which is the state, which is in some way responsible for managing some response here. But when you think about it in this triad way, you suddenly break out of this Wilson versus state mentality of the criminal justice system and start thinking about a problem across three areas and a problem of balance, right? You now are trying to balance the interests of three affected parties rather than simply trying to resolve a dispute between two. The traditional criminal justice model proposes a dispute between the state and an accused. The community justice model adds a third party, the victim, changes the state to the community, and says, now, how are you going to solve this problem? Well, each of these parties has needs, experiences, understandings, and responsibilities. I know it's a lot to argue that victims have responsibilities, but let me put it this way. We often talk about this we're used to talking about this actually in a kind of a funny way. We say, when at sentencing, we hear from the prosecutor says, the victim has been damaged so much here, Your Honor, that a penalty must be imposed that sends a message about how bad this crime was. Or this victim cannot ever recover from this. And then the court imposes that penalty, and then I ask you this, did the victim recover? And usually the answer is no. But it's ironic because if you're making this argument, to get the victim to recover, we have to do this really serious punishment on the person who broke the law, then the person who was a victim of a crime owes us something. We did it. You said you needed it. We did it. Now you got to get better. Let's get out of our way. In fact, that's in a way what we've done, right? It's sort of anti-victim in a kind of funny kind of way. We don't want to deal with all your problems. We'd rather hurt this person. We'd rather have in a Kantian sense, when a person says, I'm going to break the law against you, they say, we are not equal, you are lower than me. You count for less than me, right? I can use you for my desires. You exist for my benefit, which is a violation of the Kantian principle. We cast you down. Rather than the state saying, no, 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 that is wrong, this person counts the same as you, what we ask the state to do in traditional criminal justice is, we're going to teach you a lesson, we're going to also cast you down. The equality that we achieve is with both parties having been lessened, reduced. And that's why it doesn't feel very good, because it doesn't really produce an equality that we can be proud of or feel good about, right? No, 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 you cannot cast this person down, you must recognize this person as equal of you, would be a different response. That's the restorative response. What do communities need? Communities, so in order to engage in that, let me talk about victims again a little bit more. In order to engage in that, victims are complicated people like all of us. I don't want to stereotype victims. I also don't want to stereotype communities or people who break the law. There are millions of people in those categories and thousands of communities in those categories. They're very diverse. Let's recognize that all kinds of stories, if you want to make a point, you can find a story somewhere that will make your point. So I'm going to be talking on the average, and I'm going to be on the edge of stereotyping. I apologize for it, but I'm going to do it as a way of trying to make a point. And what I'm going to say is, I think, true enough, although there are plenty of exceptions to everything that I'm going to say. What victims want is to understand why this happened to them and to feel safe from it happening again. They need, for both of those to happen, they need for the person who hurt them to take responsibility, and they need for that person to take responsibility in a meaningful way, not just for what I did, but for my future too. In other words, a victim needs to understand what happened to me in the past, but also to understand what's going to happen to me in the future from you. The scary thing about somebody who's hurt me being paroled is that I've gotten neither of those, and now the person's back out again. It's not just that the person's being paroled, it's that I don't feel safe. If I felt safe, If I felt like I understood what happened and I'm not at risk of it again, I would have a different set of, I might feel about that parole, but I'd have a different set of feelings. What makes me so angry and upset is that I didn't even get anything out of the deal. The only thing that happened is the state got the benefit. What the community needs is that same sense of safety. You can come back here and live with us, and we won't be at your risk anymore. Right? You can live among us. You talk to family members of people who break the law, and they say this just flat out. I don't want Johnny to go to prison, but Johnny has to stop hurting everybody. If you send Johnny to prison, it's not going to do anybody any good. He's going to go there for a couple of years, cost me a lot of money, break up my family. He's going to come back, and it's still going to be the same place where we started, which is, by the way, the truth. So what the community wants is a different deal. We want to feel safe from you, from this person who hurt us. We also want to feel like you're contributing back to us, like the rest of us, that, like you're not using us to your benefit, but you're seeing yourself as equal to us in the same way. Responsible member of the community. Safety and membership. The lawbreaker wants a couple of things too. A second chance, a realistic second chance. That means a chance to make up for what I did and start over, restart, new day, and support in being able to get that done, knowing how difficult it is for me, because what I'm like is I like to use drugs, I like to get thrills, and I like to take advantage of people. If I'm not going to do those things, I need some help. Right. Now, I want to say something about that request. It's just absurd. No deals in this business, my friends. We'll give you a job so you won't hurt people. You can't hurt people whether you have a job or not. It's not an ethical choice to hurt people. You're not allowed to. Now, I understand in my interest is to help you get a job. That's in my interest, not your interest. But you can't hurt people whether you have a job or not. You can't hurt people whether you're using dope or not. You can't hurt people whether you're feeling like you're a victim of racism or not. Those don't go together. This is one of the great lessons of David Kennedy's work on stop shooting, don't shoot, in his book. That you have to delink those ideas because otherwise it's a moral depravity, right? You can hurt people because you don't have a job. I'm sorry, that's not true. There are a lot of people who don't have jobs, who don't hurt people, A, and B, not having a job is not, being a victim of racism is not permission to hurt people. Being hurt is not permission to hurt, which is also true for victims of crimes, which is also true for communities where people commit crimes. Same moral reasoning. So if you have these three parties, then the question becomes not what's the just punishment, but how do you negotiate out a solution that maximizes the chances of people getting what they need and begins with a guarantee that the people who are most wronged here go first, the victim in the community. So I imagined a world in another paper that I wrote, published last summer. I imagined a world in which the person getting sentenced to prison was worth money. And by the way, they are. There are blocks in Brooklyn where we spend $1 million a year locking up residents of that block every single year. You go to that block, you say, we're going to spend $1 million on public safety here this year. What would you like to do? They will have a different list. See, we've of course sort of fooled them. We've said, we're going to spend a lot of money on you, but here's what the deal. We're actually going to give jobs to people who live in Attica to watch your bad guys for a couple of years and send them back worse. That's the investment we're making in this block. It won't surprise you to understand that residents who get that investment for the most part say, bad deal, not our choice. You're going to spend $1 million here. We'd like to spend a couple $100,000 locking up this person and this person, and then we'd like to fix our elevators. We'd like to fix the park. We'd like to make the school system better. We'd like to have elderly get care given to them. And we'd like some stuff on this block. And $1 million in a block, you can get some stuff. So in Pennsylvania, for example, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, you're going to spend about $50,000 a year, give or take, every year you lock somebody up. So what if I said, anybody in the state of Pennsylvania can have any of those dollars as long as you take the person that goes with it? Got to meet a few rules.
Can't keep quiet. That is excellent. I'll try.
There's some rules here, by the way. First of all, if they break the law, you get fined, and the money stops to flow. You get the money on a month-by-month basis, and the money stops to flow. If you don't use that money in a way that gainfully employs them and offers employment to somebody else, in other words, you got to benefit the community too, right? Then you can't have it. And then the third thing is, you have to find a way that that person moves off onto their own. Now, you got a lot of people locked up in this state, so you're not going to do this with everybody, but I can tell you right now that if I passed a law that made it possible for people to start a business with this investment, you would have businesses starting up all over the place. I drove on a train through Philadelphia. I saw the empty houses that were all boarded up. I went to the train station where there were people who didn't have places to live. And I saw, look, talk about a fit. And you got a lot of people who aren't working, and you're paying $50,000 a year to watch them. Seems to me there's a solution here that's possible. It's also entirely consistent with the Judeo-Christian ethic. You know, it's for a converted Jew to quote Jesus back to a bunch of Christians is probably a bad idea. So I won't do that, but you can do it in your own head, right? We have obligated ourselves by our ethical choices to a different way of looking at the world than the one we have chosen as a matter of policy. So if we realigned the incentives so that the people who are currently getting the most benefits, they think, from this broken system could get benefits from fixing it, we'd start to get it fixed. It's called justice reinvestment. And it says we're going to take the money we're spending on these neighborhoods through the prison system, and we're going to spend it on these neighborhoods, investing in these places, making them better places to live, work, and raise our children. So the last point I want to make is, so what is needed now? When Harry was introduced to me, I decided to do this. I hope it works. One of my favorite prayers is the Serenity Prayer. You know, I wish I didn't have to admit this. I'm not a particularly religious fellow, but I say this prayer quite often because I think it reminds us of how small we are, but how big we are at the same time. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So, and usually, when I say that prayer to myself, I get reminded of where I actually sit in the scheme of things, and I feel much better. So what is needed now? First, I think, and I'll borrow from my Quaker history, I think we need to speak truth to power. I think we need to start talking about this problem in the way that it is a problem. We've been pussyfooting around this for a long time, acting as though we should be scared of the political interests here. But I want to just say to you, when I go out and talk to Republican business people about this, I get a much, much more positive response than when I talk to the so-called traditional Democratic left. When I talk to business people, they say, this is a waste of money, we need to think of some other way of doing it. Is there some way we can do this that creates jobs and creates businesses and stops wasting human lives? And when I talk to people on the left, I often get, well, what about the unions? They're going to disagree with you closing prisons. So the time has come to recognize that we have to stop being afraid of bringing this conversation up because somebody's going to beat us up with a victim. We have not had a presidential election where crime came up as an issue for Clinton, since Clinton. In your gubernatorial elections in this state, where crime is really a hot-button issue, it's not been the most important issue that's come up. You elected a mayor in Philadelphia who ran on a platform of reforming the criminal justice system and did not run on a crime issue. I mean, I'm just telling you, the time has changed. Let's stop being afraid of ourselves and let's start talking realistically about what's going on here. And it's not just about money. Money has created an opportunity for us, but it is really about what we get for our money. And if in 1972, if I'd said to you, this is the deal we will get and this is what we're going to do, you would not have said, yes, let's do it. So why are we beginning with it as the right as the thing that is the realistic situation? Why are we starting with it that way? Why don't we recognize that a generation-long policy error has been made, and we shouldn't be afraid of talking about it directly? The second thing, as I want to say, is the private sector is our friend. My dad's a socialist. My dad was a lifelong socialist, and I grew up in a house that was, where I used to come back from high school and stop at the John Birch Society bookstore, and in Anderson, Indiana, and enjoy getting in debates with those guys, and they would all say these things to me. And one day I said, there are no communists in Anderson, Indiana. He said, there are 3 card-carrying communists in Anderson, Indiana. Yeah, who are they? They turned out to be my dad's best friend, and my dad's office mate. So I have legitimate roots in this area, but I want to say to you that, that the private sector can be our friend here. Privatizing prisons was a big mistake, in my opinion, but the bigger mistake was privatizing just prisons, because we privatized the most expensive side of this business, where the only way you can make money is to grow the incarceration rate. If we'd said what I just said, anybody going to prison is worth money, a 10-year sentence is worth $500,000, and you can do anything with it you want, we would have exploded creative capacity. We would have empowered communities, because in those communities, every month, somebody's going to prison for 10 years. That's $1 million, $500,000 a month, up for grabs for somebody who wants to start a business in that community, and the money's there. If we had thought that the private sector really could solve our problem, rather than just saying the private sector could solve our incarceration problem. Crazy to think that if you create a private sector that is built on the idea of locking people up, you won't have a lobby for locking more people up. It's crazy. But if you create a private sector that's built on not locking people up, then we'll start to have some balance in this conversation. And I believe the research and the good common sense and today's politics would be all you'd need to be able to enliven the capacity of creative individuals and innovators to build a community justice system for you here. And the third thing I'm going to say is that this is the moment. This is the time. For the first time in 40 years, we've had 2 consecutive years in which the prison population dropped small, 0.5%, 1.5%. 2 consecutive years that the jail population dropped nationally. By the way, Pennsylvania's a different story. You guys are, but you are going to be pulled by the national pull, right? So probation populations dropped nationally for 2 years. Jail populations dropped nationally for 2 years. We are beginning to see that the punishment experiment is over. We've learned the lesson. We've figured out that it's not the investment we want to make. We are now going to be having the conversations about what the next generation will be. Don't get caught. Don't get caught in the punishment versus rehabilitation debate. It's a worthy debate, but anybody who argues we shouldn't provide rehabilitation services is just nuts. They're nuts ethically, and they're nuts empirically. But providing rehabilitation services won't get you out of the prison population problem, because prison populations are not produced by the lack of rehabilitation. Remember the iron law. They're produced by how many people go there and how long they stay. Do not get distracted from that central point. Don't get caught in the front-end, back-end dilemma. Do we work before people go in? Do they work, right? Don't get caught in that one. Because while it is true, I remember when the reentry was just discovered as an issue, and Jeremy Travis did a lot of us a great favor by writing about this. People were alarmed. Wow, 900,000 people leaving prison every year. My God, what does that mean? I would say, well, we didn't get there from nowhere. The year before it was 880. Before we discovered it was 860. It was growing about 20,000 a year. We seem to be doing just fine. Then suddenly we get this big number and it scares us. You don't like the number of people leaving prison every year? Don't put them there. The number will go down. How many people go in and how long? And by the way, since most people leaving prison have been to prison before, don't get caught in this front-end, back-end thing. They're both targets. They're both targets. And finally, the last point I would say to you is, don't get caught in this false requirement that you come up with a perfect answer. This is the trick of all time. You know, it's like anytime you have a release program, everybody who's released under that program is owned by that program. They hurt somebody, the program's wrong. But we have been releasing people from prison for over 200 years. They've been hurting people. That hasn't meant prison is wrong, right? So you don't have to come up with the perfect answer. All you have to do is beat the current craziness. No matter what you do, there will be problems, because people who go through the criminal justice system do not have a good track record. So don't kid yourself that you're going to get through this thing scot-free. You don't have to come up with a perfect system of which there are no problems. You just have to keep calling attention to the problems you're trying to solve and coming up with a better set of problems. The day we show that prisons change people's lives for the better is the day we ought to be saying we have to come up with a solution that changes people's lives for the better. The fact that prisons don't do that means all you got to do is beat the current morass, which, by the way, the creative powers of the people in this room could do. Thank you very much.
We have some time for questions. Hi, Charles Davis, Keystone College. I want to point out I'm a non-religious Democrat. I believe everything you said, because there's just common decencies that all people should know, transcending any religion or political thought. The issue, especially in northeastern Pennsylvania, and I'm not afraid to stand up there and say it, no matter who would be in the room, is always been politics. One of the things that you pointed out was the continuing depressing hand that we put on neighborhoods, which I totally believe. I mean, these are also some of the places. I'm a 14-year vet, 3 wars, you know, behind me. I'm 60% disabled vet. But there's some of the places that you see recruiting stations popping up too. So if you really start to look at it and look at the box, like you said, basically what we're doing is we're, you know, repressing a certain group of people just so that we have somebody to put behind the trigger. And the whole time that I was in the military, I saw it with my eye. I know who these people are. I grew up a little bit in the west side of Scranton, and then my mom had 4 boys. She was raised us on her own, so we got to a certain age, she had to get us out of the city. She moved us up to the country where, you know, you can't get in trouble up there. You just, you know, you hunt stuff. That's what you do. But it's that same basic, you know, mentality of to keep somebody down and in certain quarters, and then be able to use them for whatever you want to use them for. And I went right up to the commissioner of Lackawanna County and asked him what they would be having going for restorative justice, because that's what we're here for as a class that Stacy teaches, which when I started that class, I walked in there and I told her right off the bat, like, I'll tell you what, I'm of the complete opposite camp of you. I don't believe in any of this. And she changed my mind. I do think that it can work. But it's you know, when I ask the commissioner about it and he gives me the blow off, gives me the typical political gestures of let me stare at the ground, point my ear at you, like I can really hear what you're saying. You know, that's what they do. I want to really hear what you got to say. You know, followed by, oh, well, that's, you know, that's business. We're not talking business today. Call my office. Try to call me. You know, try. You're going to call 5, 10, 15 times. Nobody calls you back. Do you know what I mean? So there's people out here, you know, regardless of religion, political affiliation, any of that garbage, that totally believe in what all this is about and would really like to see it pushed. Unfortunately, you know, I'm just 60% disabled vet. You know, I have a hard enough time fighting the VA to try to change things for what's right for veterans, you know what I mean? Because we take these people out of the depressed neighborhoods, we send them overseas, we put them through, excuse my language, there's no other word for it, some real shit. And then when they come back home, how many of them are living in boxes under bridges? How many of them, the only therapy that they're getting is out of a bottle? And what are we doing as a nation to help those people? You can judge the character of a nation by how it treats its soldiers, it's been said. And you can judge the character of a nation by how it treats its prisoners, too, I think. So
So if you look at the vast majority and how we treat these people, what the heck do you expect? You know what I mean?
Thank you.
So
Yeah.
I just want to bring that up. But yeah, you don't have to be Christian or
Born again Jewish.
you don't have to be any of that stuff. You don't have to be any political party. You know, you just have to be a real human being.
Let me just say something, and we have more hands. First of all, thank you for your service. It is very true that the dynamics you describe, I think, are accurate. Let me say that I don't think politicians often lead. They generally follow. So you know, it's our job to be the leaders, ironically enough. Yeah. Here, and then I'll come to it. Yeah.
You speak to 1972. Was there a coordinated policy effort at that point that started us down this path?
There was, I think it was mostly politics, although there was a lot of things going on. You know, okay, so I'll say it. I have a book coming out that explores that issue. Mostly it was the resonance of the war on crime and Richard Nixon's ability to use that issue as a way of capturing what happened after the civil rights legislation under Lyndon Johnson. So it was about finding an image that produced a coalition of voters. On the other hand, there was also real fear in the United States because crime rates in '72 were high. They actually were higher in '62, but they were quite high. So there was a combination of factors, but there wasn't any sort of centrally coordinated activity because crime policy in the United States is done at 51 levels, the federal government and 50 states. And, so, and what happened was there was a sort of a spontaneous crime policy shift. Yeah. Right here.
When we talk about reentry for prisoners or inmates coming out of jail, I think there's another reentry. That's the officers, the guards. In California, we just had a bunch of folks cutting pensions and pay and everything else. But a lot of the guards that I work with, a lot, and I'm surprised actually, they're were former teachers, former social workers. A number of them have advanced college degrees. There's no place for them to go, and so they feel as trapped in some ways as the guys they're looking after. And I'm not sure how to go about working with that population, because it's a good deal for them for what they're doing.
So there's a couple of good studies that there's this argument that prisons are good economy. So there are a couple of studies that compare cities that got prisons, rural areas that got prisons, to rural areas that didn't get prisons over time. And they find that the economic prospects of the places that didn't get the prisons were actually better. And one of the reasons is that prisons don't have a growth curve. They're, in economics, they're what you would call a step function. You add some jobs and then everything stays stable. Whereas rural communities that were able to weather the financial storm have growth curves associated with their development. So they started off worse than the places that got the prisons, but they ended up better 10 years down the road. And there's several good studies that say prisons are not the best economic option for a rural area. That doesn't change.
I'm saying the individuals who work.
Right, and so if you're going to downsize a prison system, you have to bring those people into the conversation because their destinies actually matter as well. It's not like they don't count. But I would add to that also probation officers and parole officers. These people who work in the criminal justice system have been working under a great deal of pressure, jobs that are often frustrating for them, and handling this workload without the kind of conversation about what's in their interests. So I agree with you that you can't just downsize without taking those interests into account. Yeah.
I'm wondering, in your research and study, if you see any correlation since the year 1972 and what you've been saying with the Roe v. Wade decision, which was a year later in '73, when we as a nation legalized, no matter what each person's religious persuasion is in this room, I'm speaking from my heart, legalized the mass destruction of children in the womb, and the message that sent to the fabric of society that, you know, I'm a Russian Orthodox priest, and I'm proud to quote Mother Teresa of Calcutta, who says, if a child is not safe in the mother's womb, what hope is there for society? That resonates in our country. I remember being ordained and sent to Minneapolis, Minnesota, in an Orthodox parish, huge cathedral. And it was around Roe v. Wade time, and I said, what would happen if on your prom night you got pregnant? What would you do? 90% of them said, I would have an abortion. Why? Because our country says it's okay, it's legal. It's legal. So then I began, you know, teaching them what the church says, and, you know, just because the country says it doesn't mean that that moral is correct, that law is correct. I'm wondering, in your study, and I know you've done research, a lot of research, do you think, in all honesty, speaking from your heart, not just from your mind, is there correlation between Roe v. Wade and the problem that we found ourselves in?
So I don't know of any external study that has found that link. I don't know how you design it. There is one study done by a couple of economists from California arguing that the drop in crime rate has been associated with the increase in abortion rate. And I don't like that study particularly myself either. I think there may be a message there, just speaking from my heart, okay? So this is not speaking empirically. There may well be a message there. I think that we send the message that human beings don't count in many, many other ways as well. And that the legality of abortion may be one of them, but it's certainly not the one that resonates the most in my opinion. Yeah, here and then in front, yeah.
My wife and I started an organization called Cure right after Attica. Went back of all places to Texas. And I have been lobbying, starting in Texas and also in Congress for the last 40 years. In fact, beginning in 1972. It seems to me, like the gentleman said, the priest said, and the gentleman talked about, that we have had the greatest change or debate about cultural changes in our society, in the history of our society in the last 40 years too. And it's been my experience. I can remember in Texas, there was a concern of gun control. Well, what did they do? People came up with mandatory minimums. That came out of Texas. In fact, Texas ended up, it's amazing, we ended up going to Congress and Texas almost followed us, which is law and order. And so I think a lot of what you're saying, and even today, right now, I mean, we go back to the Willie Horton case, we go back, even though it's crime and everything, if they're going to, in this particular presidential race right now, if they get down to it, if they get seen, that's why Obama's not coming through with any pardons. We all know that. That's the great fear. The Willie Horton is still out there 20, 25 years later. So I think a lot of what, and let me just say too, what's the big issue right now? Sex offenders. You know, you look at today's paper, the big trial starting up at Penn State, etc. Okay, people don't even know that we have civil commitment in our society. There are 20 states that actually, when people finish their criminal sentences, they actually begin serving a civil sentence, you know. Who's leading the charge in this Adam Walsh Act in Congress, in my opinion? Well, the Democrats. This is their token right-wing issue that they can say we're not soft on crime. I think a lot of the increase in population, and I agree totally with what you're saying, but a lot of it is, can you top this, can you use this as a political weapon? And I think that. One last thing, specific question. I'm fascinated by non-profit private prisons. And this is non-profit private schools. This is what this is, right? Why can't we use that in what you're talking about? Not for-profit prisons, but non-profit prisons. And I know there was some research, maybe there is, but it seems to be that more research should be done on this. Anyway.
So I'm sympathetic to the idea of trying to get non-traditional people involved in the justice system. I think the problem with getting the private sector, even the nonprofit private sector, involved in the incarceration side is that unless you do something on the non-incarceration side to compete with it, right, you've got an unfair deal. Yeah. So you've got sort of the creative and entrepreneurial juices all unleashed for an incarceration experience, and none of it unleashed for a non-incarceration experience. That has been the problem. It's not that I'm opposed to, I have views about privatization of prisons, which are not important. The problem is privatizing one side without creating competition. In other words, if you have a monopoly for incarceration, for the private sector using incarceration to grow the private sector, even if it's nonprofit private sector, you will by definition weaken the non-incarceration side.
The only thing I was thinking is the present private prisons we have now, to begin to move them, to raise the issue. Why don't you move toward a nonprofit?
Well, I understand that. If I were choosing an argument, I wouldn't start there. The reason I wouldn't start there is that the Prison Fellowship runs a prison in Texas. It's a non-profit private institution, and they spend all their time sort of thinking about what to do about getting people who are incarcerated to be able to be in their prison and treating them well, and they spend none of their time. They have a Justice Fellowship side that's a different issue. They spend none of their time thinking about what do we do about the problem of too many people in prison.
Okay, one last thing. Suppose Bill Gates said, give me 300, I will start a prison, we will do computers every day, and when they're released, I'll give them jobs.
I believe deeply, this is a belief statement, I believe deeply that there is a very low ceiling of possible effects of treating people humanely in prison. That people in Europe, in the Netherlands, get short sentences with lots of programs and lots of access to programs, and they have about the same recidivism rate we do. I think that this is a deep personal belief, if you think, I think prisons should be humane, and I believe people who go to prison should be treated humanely, should be given opportunity for rehabilitation programs. It is both ethically and empirically unwise to do otherwise. But if that's where you start, you're going to end up with the system we have today. That's what I believe.
Well, I'm just saying you've got to start. The system we have today, how do we change that? That's
yeah,
the question.
Right. Yeah.
Right, but how do you get rid of it?
Right. Yeah, okay. I had a long conversation with Richard Gere about this in the days when Richard Gere was interested in prison reform. And I said, okay, just imagine that when you are done, and he was being guided by all the right urges as I think you are, all the right ethical and moral beliefs as you are. And I said, just imagine that at 5 years from now, you've finished doing what you're doing, you get up in the morning, and you look in the mirror and you say, I was able to produce a truly humane imprisonment experience for more people. Did you really use your time in the way you wanted to? That's the question. And in other words, you might be successful, and on this other agenda you might fail. Fair enough. But the question is, when you get up in the morning and put on your tie, or maybe you don't put on a tie, wash your face and brush your teeth, and you look in the mirror, what was the thing that you stood for? That's the question, I think.
The only thing I would say is, the last thing is, go and lobby. You gotta talk to politicians where they are now.
I totally get it. I get that. I absolutely agree with you. Yeah.
Another correlation question. During the recent Occupy movement, there was a lot of discussion about the income gap between the 1% and 99%. They showed a chart tracking the widening gap since 1980. And I looked at it and I said, gee, this looks an awful lot like the incarceration rate. And I wonder if you think there's any correlation between the two.
There is, but it's complicated. Bruce Western's new book, Punishment and Inequality, makes the point. It's mostly felt in poor communities. It's not a broad national pattern that affects most of the people in this room. It really is, it's concentrated in its effects in minority communities. There are a couple of papers that are really interesting. There's a paper that shows what the unemployment rate is if you keep 1972 incarceration rate stable. And we would have an unemployment rate that would not allow any of the political parties to have stayed in power. But it would have been concentrated among young men of color. And the second study is that there's a pretty good set of arguments that can be made that it is the gap between the haves and the have-nots that is most predictive of overall crime rates patterns in the United States. But to blow that up, crime rates are dropping, and they've been dropping for a decade, and the gap has been increasing. So I find those studies unpersuasive, personally. I think that, again, this is personal. I think that the way inequality works is that in order for it to be sustained, it requires fear of an underclass, and the fear of the underclass produces that need for an incarceration rate. I'll go here. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
A simple question and then a more interesting one. The simple one is, can you or your fellow geniuses come up with a better word than criminal justice system, which is wrong because there is no system until lawmakers become accountable? Don't answer that. Just think about it. The real question I want to hear, and I think the rest of us do, is do you have examples of where some of the community justice ideas are being tried right now?
Well, yeah, and the examples are interesting because they provoke both optimism and pessimism at the same time. There are 13 states involved in the justice reinvestment movement. Go to the Council of State Governments website, look up justice reinvestment, you'll see some of the work. State of Michigan closed 22 prisons and saved $1 billion a year, reinvested about 3/4 of that in communities, particularly Detroit. The state of Kansas and the state of Kansas reduced incarceration growth from a trajectory of a 10% annual growth to a stable pattern, took a portion of the difference and reinvested it in drug treatment programs. There are similar stories, Connecticut and some others. Every one of these stories has ways in which I wish it were a better story, right? But again, let me remind you, the job is not to come up with the perfect solution. The job is that's a trap, because one does not exist. The job is to come up with a better set of problems than the one we have now. Michigan, for example, right now is struggling because some of the work they did, they're undoing, and they closed a prison in Detroit, they reopened it. They closed it for 6 months, they reopened it. So the struggle's on in Michigan. But even if you tell the worst possible story in Michigan right now, they still closed 20 prisons. 20 prisons. So, and saved $1 billion. So this work is going on right now. There is on the youth side, nationally, the story is entirely different. Youth incarceration in the United States is about 1/3 what it was 20 years ago. And that's with the same base number of youth of the age group. And that's because it's so expensive and it travels so far under the radar screen that sensible policies have been put in place nationally in almost every state, including this state, to try to minimize the use of incarceration for youth. Because the story is so dumb. It is, this person's 15. Do we lock this person up for the next 6 years at about $150,000 a year? This person's 18. Do we lock this person up for the next 6 months, and then they come out, on the youth incarceration side, the choices are so problematic that coming up with other kinds of strategies has stayed below the radar screen. So in every place where they have cut back on youth incarceration, there is a policy story behind it. In Ohio, it's Reclaim Ohio, where if you don't send somebody to the state juvenile prison system, you get the money. So counties get the money. The counties have used the money to do all kinds of things. It's also true in Oregon. California is just about ready to adopt that system on the adult level. So there's lots of stories out there. Are they perfect? Far from it. Would I say adopt them lock, stock, and barrel? I'm not that dumb. Is there so much activity going on right now that you ought to get your hat in the ring and start working on this? Absolutely.
Last question, one last.
I'm sorry.
I'll just throw out a little gauntlet or whatever. You referred to Roe versus Wade, and I'll say amen to that, but go back to the beginning. What changes society?
Well, so let me say something about violence rates historically for human beings. A recent book done by Michael Tonry looking at violence rates going back to about the 1200s. Now, it's very difficult to get violence rates because you have to use data about you have to get more death certificates and a lot of other things. But as best he can put the data together, it looks like in this kind of a pattern, violence rates have been dropping for human beings for centuries. We are less violent to each other today, believe it or not, than we were 300 years ago. I know it sounds remarkable because we believe in a different truth, right? But when you actually measure people who died as a result of being hurt by their fellow man, the rates are, we are talking about all sorts of, all types of death, non-war death, all types of non-war death, right? War is much more lethal now than it ever was, right? So you take war out of the equation, and you can make an argument, and this argument has been made by philosophers, that there is a civilizing ethic at play underneath. That there's fluctuations around it, but if you look at this in the long term, in the long frame, that human beings are becoming less violent toward each other over time. I know there's tons of problems with that argument, but when I look at his data, it's hard to argue because the effects are so large over a long period of time.
Well, what I was going to refer to is in the 1800s, there were some big revivals in this country, and they changed the country in many, many ways. And they changed the way a lot of policy, well, the way people live would truly change. And that includes the healing, the strengthening, the empowering, the unifying of the family, the brick of good life, you know. Mm-hmm. And so I'm saying, what we truly need is go right back to the beginning with faith, with real active faith. And one thing, just a quote that I like, Luther Burbank, the most successful horticulturalist in our country, said, if you want to change the grandfather, start with the grandchild. And I think it's true. Start at the beginning. And I also think, to think that we're going to get any solutions from politicians is a mistake. I think God might have some better responses to offer.
Thank you. So,
before we go, as a follow-up to this, a concrete follow-up.
You're killing me, Paul. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a bill that's going to be introduced in the next 10 days in the Congress, the United States. It needs 3 votes to pass. And I'd like to have Charlie talk about it.
Very quickly.
He's an expert on this fight.
We have I think most people should be familiar with Senator Jim Webb's bill to create, I think Dr. Clear, you would be familiar, right? We are very close to doing exactly what you're talking about, is having an overall study by politicians, though, at least passing it, but then having people like Dr. Clear to look at a commission, a 14-member commission, 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, would have 18 months to look at the entire criminal justice system. There was a vote about a year ago, and we had 4 Republicans and all Democrats vote for it. So we're trying to turn 3 Republicans in the next 10 days or so. One of those is Senator Toomey from Pennsylvania, who I've heard is open to criminal justice reform. So we're using this as an opportunity to do a petition. So we'd like for people who are Pennsylvania constituents to sign it and to see me all doing this next 2 or 3 days, and we will submit it. We're going to bring it to, I think Father Bill's going to bring it to the staff for Senator Toomey here. I'm going to bring it, I talked to the people at his office in Washington, but one way or the other, we're going to give him, hopefully, a lot of names that he should vote our way when it comes up. Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you again, Dr. Clear.